Hey guys, Sean Frangella here with a new tutorial that's all about taking logos from Illustrator, extruding them and adding the 3D aspect in Cinema 4D, and then bringing it into After Effects using the new Cineware effect and plugin built into After Effects CC to add our color correction and extra post-production effects. So our plan is we're going to start here with the Seahawks logo in Illustrator, do all of our 3D work, which is this screenshot, and then our goal is we get here. Now, I'm in Chicago, but I picked the Seahawks logo because it's a good example of kind of a more complex logo that'll have a couple of challenges that'll bring us through some good examples of how to do some of these techniques in Cinema 4D. So I'm going to start here in Illustrator, and I just got this logo off the web. If you're looking for Vector Sports logos or any company logos, it's usually pretty easy to find the vector version of it. If you just Google the name of the company plus vector logo, you can get some sites that have archives of the logos in vector format. And we want to be sure that we're using vector because what we're going to use is the paths. So if I highlight everything, these paths are going to be what we're extruding when we hop into Cinema 4D. So if you have a JPEG or a GIF, it's not going to get as clean of a result, and you're not going to be able to work with it. So this graphic is pretty well prepped because it's already all cut up and it has different sections for all of the colors. And a good test to do this is if you make everything the same color and then flip our colors over here or press Shift X back and forth, we can see that all the lines are separated out correctly. So we don't want a bunch of shapes on top of shapes and kind of pretending like it's this straight line. We want to make sure that we have this straight line. So this came in as an SVG online, which is fine, but we want to save this out as an Illustrator 8 to bring it into Cinema 4D. So I'm going to File, Save As, go to My Project, and I'm going to save this logo. So I'll just call it Seahawks logo Illustrator, and we want to be sure that we save as Illustrator 8 way back here because this is what 3D programs are going to be able to read. So I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to hop into Cinema 4D. Now I'm on R15 Studio, which is the full studio version with all the bells and whistles, but I do want this tutorial to be accessible to people who might be on Cinema 4D Lite from After Effects. So I have a copy of Cinema 4D Lite open also, and I'm just going to point out a couple things as we go along this and open that up as I need to about a few things that would need to be done a little differently if you are running Cinema 4D Lite, because a couple of things are not there in that version. So let's get right to it. We have our Illustrator file saved, so in Cinema 4D or Cinema 4D Lite, I'm going to go up here, File, Merge, and I'm going to find my logo. So I've saved it as Illustrator. I'm going to open. And this is important. I'm going to not connect splines and not group objects. So these might be checked as default. And I'm going to do this because I want all the paths to be separated and I just don't want it in groups. I want to be able to control them separately automatically. So I'm going to go to OK. And it's still going to come in as a null, which is fine. And have a couple groups in this case. And I'm just going to select my actual paths, and if I pan over here, I can see it came in a little off from the center axis, so that's fine. I can move those back. I'm just going to select these paths, take them out of these groups, and just delete all the actual groups. So now I have my 7 paths, and first thing I'm going to do is just zero all those out so I get them in the center of my scene. And let's just start extruding. So we'll start with this big shape here, which is our outline in white. And I'm just going to start naming these as we go through this so we can keep all of this organized. So I'm going to double click, name this white, and keep them up here in the file manager organized as I go through them. So I have white, and I'm going to go up here and get our extrude and drop this white into the extrude. And there we go. We're starting to get some depth to this. So I'm going to make this a little bigger. I'm going to make 60 centimeters, and that's a good start. And I'm also going to change our caps over here and add a fillet cap to both, leave it at convex, and add this at 2 steps and a radius of 2. And that'll give us a little more beveling on this and make it look a little more realistic. When we see sports logos, they're always really chiseled and there's a lot of depth, and this will just help us get that. And there's a couple other bevel fillet styles over here in our fillet type, like concave, half circle, 1-step, 2-step, which are all really cool too, and we'll add a couple of those other ones later on for the different parts. And I like to work with this display with lines on, so I'm going to go to display, garage shading, lines, and just get all of those on. And that shows that I want to remember another step of this type. I want to change this to quadrangles. Now, we can leave it as n-gons, but that can cause problems later. You could triangulate it, but I'm just going to go quadrangles, and we can see that this will give us all of the polygons actually being cut up as opposed to just this one n-gon shape. So I have my outer shape. This is good. I'm getting some depth here, and we're getting there. So just to keep things moving along, I'm going to add a new material down here to get this white color. Because if we press Command R now, it's just this gray shape. So I'll just call this texture white, and I'll double click this, and I'm just going to make a little bit of basic textures just to get some color shading and reflections when we add lights later. Not too complex, but just add a bit of detail to it. So I'm just going to make this white. Since I know that this is white, I don't need to grab the colors from the Illustrator document quite yet. And I'm going to add a bit of reflection. Now I'm going to leave it at 100 brightness, and we'll probably tweak this later, but I'm going to put on Frangella so we get that edge to it. So it's not fully reflective, and maybe turn it down a little, but so there's partial reflections, but not fully chrome. So we see if it's not on this, and we leave it at 100, we're just going to get that huge chrome ball and kind of lose our color texture. So again, little arrow and Frangella, and I'll just turn this down to 50, and again, we'll tweak all these later more. That'll give us kind of a base. So I'll drag this, I could, onto my shape or onto this extrude, and that's going to drop the texture onto everything beneath it. So now if I Command R to render, I see that I'm getting some color, which is a good start. But as we're looking around this, it reminds me that whenever we see these sports logos, they're always really big and heroic, and this just looks kind of, it's a logo, but it's not as big and theatrical as we would think it would be. So this is a good time to add a camera and kind of set this up. So we have our camera now. I'm going to press the white little square here so we're actually in the camera. And I'm going to change the focal length all the way down to 18. And it's going to look like it's moving away, but it's actually changing the focal length. And if you're familiar with film, once we zoom back in here, now this thing looks really big and heroic. And we're getting that lens distortion that you would see from a fisheye type lens. And if we click this little white square again, it's going to zoom us out of the camera so that we can still move around and light our scene without that distortion. So I'll pop back in here. We have our logo set up, and this would be a good time now to add lights in the floor and kind of get our basic scene set up before we do the rest of the extrusions. So I'll pop back out, and we're thinking about our big picture, so I'm going to add the lights and floor, but first I'm going to change our render settings to our video format because we're just defaulted to Cinema 4D, so I'm going to put this at, in this case, 1280 by 720. So when we start rendering to the picture viewer and ultimately After Effects, we're coming in with an aspect ratio that's appropriate for video. And we'll get into a lot of these other render settings later, as well as some of the differences if you're on Cinema 4D Lite. So that gives me my video format, and you can see here we'll get a little bit of gray bars at the top and bottom so it can tell you what your live area is. So first thing I want to do is just make a flat, solid plane and move it down, and this will be our floor. Now we'll probably end up moving this a little more later. I just want to get it below it enough without it cutting in so we can have some shadows on there. But not so close that it's actually sitting on there. And I'm going to just make this huge, just make it 10,000 by 10,000. And you could also do kind of the same thing under here, under the environment tab with the floor, but I just want to have this because I want to have control over moving it around and have more control over my scene in this case. But either of those would work fine. So I'm going to have this, I'm going to copy and paste this texture, call it floor, and since when we go back to our logo, we have this dark blue and kind of these emerald color schemes for Seattle. So I'm going to make this a dark green, not necessarily from exactly one of these, but just to get kind of something that will build well with the color scheme of the logo. I'm just going to get dark green, kind of towards the bluish end of the spectrum. Click OK. And then I'll drag this onto my floor, and I'll double click this and rename it floor. Now, if we press render, Command R, we can see that it's a little reflective, so I want to soften that up a bit so it's not so reflective, so maybe 25. And I also want to add a little bit of blurriness to this reflection, so down here at the bottom is a quick 5%, and I'm going to change the mix mode to multiply from normal. That way it'll blend better with this original green. So now if I close this dialog box and do a quick little render in the viewport, we're going to see that we get a reflection, but it's nice and blurred and a bit softer, which looks a little, quite a bit better than just mirroring the objects on the floor. So now I'm going to light my scene with basic 3-point lighting, but get some color in the lights and get some shadows on that floor. So I'm going to add one light, move it just kind of over here off to the left, and I'll make that a little bit of an orangish color, just a little bit of color to make it interesting. Change the shadows, in this case, to soft. We could use area too, but we'll just use soft for now. Pop back into the camera, and now render this. And we're getting a shadow, and we're getting a little bit of color in here. So let's pop back out. I'll move my floor down a little. And this would probably be a good time too to just turn this grid off, because we have our floor, we have our object, we don't really need to see this. So I'm going to filter, grid, and just get rid of that for now. So I have my one light. I'll turn down the brightness a little, and basically what I want to do is set up basic 3-point lighting. So I have this, I'll call this my key light. I'll copy paste that, move it over here, maybe down a little, turn the brightness down, and this can be my fill light, so we're getting some more visibility on those edges, but still with our main light coming from over here. And then I'm just going to copy paste this again, move it kind of in the back and turn it really more subtle, just kind of over here a bit, and make it a little light blue. And again, you could play with different colors. This is just something that I found that works pretty well. Take down the intensity, kind of line it up. And I could use my views, but I'm just kind of doing this all in this one view for now. To line it up behind this extrude. And this will be our rim light. So we'll just get a little bit of edge light on the top of that extruded logo. Turn that up a little bit. And I'm going to take the shadows off of that just because I don't need that for shadows, just to kind of edge out this extrude. So now, and like you would do in film, I can first rename these. So key, fill, rim light. And I like my camera at the top, then my light, so I'm just going to move these around a little. I can audition these on and off to see how this is affecting the object. So if I just have my key on, render, it's getting our main object, our fill light, filling in that object a bit, and then our rim light is just adding a little highlight here, which is nice. And I'm going to go back into my material for this and just add a little bit of higher specularity, just to kind of increase that little highlight. We can see as we change our specular in our texture. We're changing that little fake highlight that's being added by the light. So good little thing to play around with for that highlight. So again, I'll quickly render it. That's a little too much. Tone that down a little. And just to get a little bit of softness in the middle there. Good. So now what I want to do is add a bunch more extrudes to each of these paths. So we have our main extrude. This is our white. We set up our lights and camera and our floor, so we're getting our shadows. And I have all of these other paths that I'll drag down here just to keep organized that I want to do kind of the same thing. And that's the nice thing about working in Cinema 4D is after we've made this extrude object, we turn it off, we can see it's still just the line. If we rendered that line, it's not going to show up. But all the extrude properties are within this. So I could copy paste this and then replace this spline with the other paths. But right now they're all just path 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I want to rename these first based on what I know that they are and how I'm going to want to organize it. So this is my second path, and if I go over to Illustrator, I can see that that's this blue, so I'll just call this blue. And these three are all these interior white colors, which we're going to group together and extrude at the same time later. So this calls in 1, in 2, in 3, and then we have our eye, and this last one is this back gray. So let's call that gray. So now what I can start doing is taking this and copy paste this whole extrude, drag it down here just to keep organized. I can delete this white extrude from it and replace the path as a child with a new path, in this case this blue, turn it back on, and it's kind of blending together because right now we have both of these extrudes set to the same depth. So on the second one, extrude 1, if I change this to 65 and move this out, and this is when I would want to use multiple views so I can really make sure that this is coming out pretty accurately. And I could do this with the numbers too, and we can set that up later. You could set that up to be more accurate, but I just want to get mostly there right now. So now if we render this, and I'm going to start doing picture viewer renders, so I'll do Shift R so we can save our progress of these. We can see that, all right, this is starting to look like a logo. But it's all the same color, so we're going to have to make more textures for each of those colors. But what's nice is each of these textures that we've already set up, we can copy paste those and just change the color to the new color. So I'm going to copy paste this, rename this one blue, double click, and then in the color tab, I'm going to go over to Illustrator, sample this, and grab my RGB colors, so 0, 41, 94, 0, 41, 94, close this out, and then I can delete this texture, drag this new blue onto that extrude, and Shift R again. So now we're getting somewhere. We're getting depth and multiple colors and textures. But I want to add a little more render settings to make this a little sharper, and also add ambient occlusion in to start getting some of those interior shadows. So I'm going to go to my render settings, and for R15 I'm going to change this to physical so we get the more advanced. If you're in Cinema 4D Lite, there isn't the physical render, but if you're in standard, you could, for your final render, turn on higher anti-aliasing. And it's not going to be the same renderer, but it's going to help some of that hard edges. So I'm going to change this to physical, and I'm going to, under Effect, add ambient occlusion. So now if I shift render again, it's going to take a little longer, but we're starting to get some of those shadows in there. You can see that we're getting some shadows, and we're getting a little noise, but we can always, for the final render, turn up our physical render settings to have higher resolution. But since we're just going through everything now and I want quick renders, I'll just leave that on for now. So we've set up our lights, our floor, we kind of have our scene if we pop out of the camera, and really now it's just repeating those steps and adding more extrudes. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of these interior whites and put that in extrude. So I'm going to copy paste this first extrude because I already have my white texture on it. Drag this down, delete this white, and we run into a little bit of a problem that we have to add an extra step in when we drag this into the extrude. And I'll just make this extrude 70 so we can start to see it. It's just going to extrude by default that first shape, and that's not what we want. And I don't want to have a bunch of extrudes because if I change this, I don't want to have to change it 3 times. So what we need to do is combine each of these splines into one spline. So I'm going to drag this back out for now, turn off these extrudes just so I can see just this spline. And if I'm in R15, I'm going to add a connect object, drag those in, and then click the connect object, press C to make it editable, and then I have one path. So if I drag this connect back into this extrude, I'll rename it just ins for interiors, turn this on, and now we can see that it's grouped all of them together, and that's great, that's what we want. And as I've said, there's a couple of things that aren't included if you're in Cinema 4D Lite with these objects and kind of the more advanced polygonal modeling. So you're not going to see connect, and what you can do over here, I have this project kind of at the same spot. You can grab each of those paths. So if you have, I'll just grab these 2 paths and drag them out. So if you're in Cinema 4D Lite, what you're going to have to do is add a spline mask, which will combine 2 of these. So grab 2, in the other file's case, the interiors, drop them in as a tile, click the spline mask, make sure it's an A union B, press C to make that editable, so now you have one object. Then make another spline mask, drag those 2 in, make that editable, and then you'd have one solid object. So either of those work, it's just one extra step if you're on Cinema 4D Lite. So back in our main project right now, if I turn back on all these extrudes, I have my outer white, my inner blue, and all my little white details. So this is getting there and looking pretty good so far. If I quickly render this again. But for these interiors, this would be a good example to use some of these other cap types because we want, even more depth. If we change this to engraved and make sure in our views that it's viewable and make this a little bigger, so I'll go with 75 and make sure it's visible on both sides. Then we're getting a bunch of bonus edges and more of that chiseling in there, which looks nice. Again, we'll render again. Change this back to standard just for now. And we can see how much extra shadows and depth that adds, which is really, really nice. We go from just basic, adding ambient occlusion, normal depth, and then just changing that bevel fillet type to a new option. Look at all that extra detail we get, which is nice. So I'm going to keep going with this. We're going to take, again, just copy paste. In this case, I'll do the blue extrude, drag it down, delete that path. I'll drag in my gray, copy paste the texture, call this gray. And this is just kind of the busy work of doing this stuff when it's this complex of a logo with multiple colors. So we're dragging our numbers back over, 178, 183, 187. And just Same thing, delete this texture. Make sure I hit the right numbers and it's not yellow. Drag this one onto this extrude so that gray is covered. Turn this on and make sure that this is the same depth as our blue. So 65, because we want it all to line up. Just double check our views to make sure it's moved out enough. And we could even just go fully into this view and get everything kind of lined up exactly how we want it, because we can see all of the edges here. And we're getting there. We only have one more to do. So we're going to just do this again, copy paste that extrude, delete this gray. We want to put our eye in here and make this 65, maybe make that 70 just because it's the eye and it's kind of the focus of the logo. Drag this out in Z space. So I'm going to turn this on, grab my extrude, and pull this over. And we need another texture for our eye here. So I'm going to, again, just copy paste any of these, call this eye for that green, hop back into Illustrator, sample this eye. So 77, 189, 56, 77, 189, 56, and drag this onto here. And now if we render, we're just about there. We are getting there. This logo is almost done. But I want to add a little more with that eye because it's kind of the focal point of this image. And I'm going to just show this at 100% so we don't see so much of that chiseling or the anti-aliasing. And on the eye, I want to add a bunch of luminance at this same color. So I'm going to turn on luminance, remember those numbers, and I already forgot, so I'm going to check back, 77, 189, 56. And turn this way up, maybe not that high, but we're going to go over 100 and we're going to get this glowing effect. And I want to show what this looks like, but I don't want to re-render the whole thing every time. So this is a good point to use Option R for render our little work area. And I can render just this area and turn up this little arrow or down to get better settings and a better render. So it's going to quickly render just this little area, and I can see how that's looking. So I'll turn my brightness down just a little, maybe turn my color down a little, probably doesn't matter. And it's going to calculate this automatically because this is my region of interest and render area, which is nice. So now I'll turn on my physical render in R15 to get a better idea of this for a full render. Do Shift R again. And look at that, that's coming out nice. That thing is really glowing, and that's adding a lot of interest to this piece. So one thing I want to do, and again, this is one little difference from Cinema 4D Lite to R15 in the full studio, is in my render settings, I'm going to turn on global illumination. And this is going to calculate our lighting. So I'll do another render while I'm talking about this. It's going to calculate how the light is bouncing around in our scene and reflect back onto the object. So we can see we're getting a lot of light reflected from that luminance of that eye, which is nice, as we can see this calculating this whole pass of the lighting. So all of that light that's emitting from that eye is going to bounce around and hit all the other objects, which is going to come out pretty nice once this is done. So already we can jump back to our last one and to our new one. We can see it's very subtle, but if we look at places like here, we're getting that light emitting that's hitting the other surfaces. And same thing with the ground, is we have our key light over here and our fill and our rim light, and those are hitting the floor and then bouncing back up. So a little bonus thing, if you're doing this in studio, that comes out a little nicer. Again, if you're in Cinema 4D Lite, that's not there, but not the biggest deal, but I did want to include it just because it is a nice feature of the full physical render and GI settings in the studio version. So we're here now, and we're pretty much done with the technical part of the project. We have all of this extruded, and we've added some nice caps, and we have lights and some glows. And I want to point out some things about some of these settings and just further editing projects in the creative part of it before we get this into After Effects. I took a pause and rendered out as a still frame with all the GI settings turned up on high, as well as global illumination on, and it came out like this. So it's a lot nicer. You can see that we're not getting the noise in those shadows and in the AO. But this as a still frame, it did take 3 minutes 30 seconds to render, and I'm on a computer with 32 gigs of RAM and 2 gigs of the video card, so it is a pretty quick computer. So you want to keep in mind, if you're doing a still and you have the time to render this out, turn all those settings up. If you're doing animation ultimately, which is what we're going for if we're moving this into After Effects, you might want to not have the GI on, and it's kind of, it depends how long you want to take this to render versus how much you need those settings high. Especially if it's animation and things are moving quickly and there's motion blur, you might not need that. So the last couple things I want to do in Cinema 4D is we have all these parts, and ultimately we're going to want to animate this. So I'm going to put all of it into a null. So I'm going to create object null, call this logo, drop this down. I'm going to put all of our extrudes into that null. So then when we move it around, we move our whole logo. And one thing I want to do before moving it and rotating it is we can see that our axis is a little off. And if I want this to be rotating, I want to rotate it from the center of the logo and control it like that. So I'm going to go to Mesh, Axis Center, and I'm going to Axis Center to all points, and I'm going to make sure Include Children and Include All Objects are on. And I'm going to go to Execute, and you can see it moves this to the center, which is nice. So now say this was animating around or spinning. It's all going to be moving from that center point as one thing. So now, again, if we do a quick render, it wouldn't look any different, but it'll help us later when we're doing animation. And for project organization, we just have one file. Now, after all the technical stuff is done, it's kind of just the lighting and camera part of it. So a couple of things I noticed I want to do is I want to change this shadow to area so it comes out a little softer and nicer. Maybe turn up these lights a little, just kind of move things around a bit, and kind of just go through the process of making little tweaks, maybe move the camera, and kind of give yourself the time to really play with the lights and set up your scene once you have the technical part done. It's an important part of the process. So I have this done. I've saved my file. I'm going to hop into After Effects, and if you're going from Cinema 4D Lite, the file will already be there. Over here in After Effects, so I'm going to just double click to import that Cinema 4D file. And this is what's great about the new version of After Effects Creative Cloud, is I can just drag this on a new project, the same thing I would do with footage, and it's going to bring that scene in. Now I haven't had to render anything out from Cinema 4D. I can do it all in After Effects after I do my compositing. So I'm going to change my renderer to standard final because that'll get us our preview. It's going to take a second to preview and build this together because it's going to build it at full time. I might even set this to half. But once that's rendered, maybe I'll go full. We're going to see what that rendered frame would look like from Cinema 4D, which is great because now we can do some of our compositing. And I'm just going to quickly add an adjustment layer called CC and throw a curves on there. And you can see it's calculating that frame behind it. So I'll add a curves, I'll add another one, so another adjustment layer. We're going to make a quick vignette on all of it, so I'll just take brightness, contrast. I'm going to zoom out because I don't need to render it the full frame every single time. So I've added a little bit of color correction curves to kind of expand our range. I'll call this vignette, and I'm just going to bring the brightness down. And again, this is all just compositing to taste effects and things. I'm going to double click the ellipse, M twice for our mask, invert that mask and just feather it out. So then I get a nice, really subtle, soft focus. And then before we get into animation, the couple things I had in the final one was a bunch of those flares. So I'm going to use Video Copilot's optical flares, which is one of those plugins that you always see. It's kind of industry all over the place. You definitely should pick it up. If you don't have it, you could recreate this with little glows and stuff, and I'll quickly go through how to do that in the next video. But for now, I'm going to use optical flares, so I'm going to add a new solid. So I'll just do Command Y. I'll call this flares. The coloring doesn't matter, but just so I can keep track of it in a stack, I'm going to make it a bright pink. Dropped optical flares onto this. I'm going to go to options. I saw this one that I really liked over here for this logo in Conspiracy Pack. Again, you can get all of that at videocopilot.net if you're looking for these packs. This is just to show how we could do some extra compositing and throw some other elements on here. So I'm going to change this onto on transparent, and I'm going to change the mode to attract light so I can have a couple of these. So they're going to disappear. Then I'm going to add a new light. I'll make this one and this bluish color and then a little brighter. So once I do that, that's going to appear back there based on the brightness. So I'm going to, I'll just move that one over here, and that'll be kind of on the tail. And I'll just duplicate that light, move that down. And over here, this can be our kind of front little flare. And I'm going to take down the brightness and make this kind of a gold light to kind of match some of the lighting and just give us some nice color variation. Maybe a little lighter so it doesn't get kind of yellowy looking. So yeah, there we go. That's looking pretty good. As soon as this renders this full frame, we could take a look at it, and we haven't even rendered the whole project out. I just got a couple color correction layers, the lights and the flare to get some detail in there. And at this point, it's kind of just to taste to get it to look, how you want and play around with these flares. And as I said, you could kind of mimic this by just doing, a couple quick little shapes. It's not going to look the same, and it's a way to get there. But just if you're trying to throw some glows on here, we could always just make a little glow, add a Gaussian blur on it, take down or bring up the blurriness, just add kind of a glow from stylize, change this to transfer mode, something that looks nice. So, we could recreate those and kind of add more shapes, but I don't want this tutorial to be so long, so for now, let's just take a look at it with this composite, and yeah, that's pretty close to what we came up with in the test run to get to this. So in the next video, we'll go over how to animate all this stuff, because that's what we're ultimately trying to do, and in this one, we'll get more into how to block stuff up and talk about depth maps and all of that, and more of the linking features between Cinema 4D and After Effects with the new Cineware plugin. But for now, that should be a pretty good, thorough explanation of how to do this. So yeah, thanks for listening, and this is Sean Frangella, and I'll see you at the next video.